Hello and welcome. My name is Anne-Marie Buzatu and I'm a Senior Advisor to ICT4Peace. I'm happy to launch today the first in a series on the work of ICT4Peace through conversations with members of its team and with its partners. To that end, I'm happy to be joined today by Ambassador Paul Meyer. Ambassador Paul Meyer is a Fellow in International Security and an Adjunct Professor of International Studies at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. Previous to this, he served for 35 years in the Canadian Foreign Service, where he held multiple high-level diplomatic posts all over the world. Throughout his career, Meyer has sought to promote international security by means of creative diplomacy. He currently teaches a course entitled Inside Diplomacy, A Practitioner's Perspective at Simon Fraser University School for International Studies. He's also engaged in research and writing on the issues of nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament, outer space security, and cybersecurity. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome to this conversation Ambassador Paul Meyer.
Well, thanks, Anne-Marie. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Now, the first question I want to ask you is, what do you mean by creative diplomacy?
Well, there's no special magic about that term. I just see it as being creative in the search for diplomatic solutions, being able to think outside of the box, and maybe by doing so to get out from the hole that could be dug if we are stuck in a rut in terms of our approaches. So I see this as incumbent on diplomats to be always searching for the effective approach and to be creative in that endeavor. And if I can cite an example, you won't be surprised that I have great respect for an earlier Canadian diplomat who went on to become both our foreign minister and ultimately our prime minister, and that is Lester Pearson. And he, in tandem with UN Secretary General Doug Hammarskjöld, essentially can claim, I think, paternity for UN peacekeeping, the whole concept. You can search in vain in the UN Charter for a reference to peacekeeping, but Pearson and Hammarskjöld, in searching for a peaceful resolution of the Suez Canal crisis of 1956-57, initiated the UN Emergency Force, essentially the first UN peacekeeping mission. So in my mind, that an excellent example of creative diplomacy at work.
In terms of the diplomatic discussions in the diplomatic sector, what kind of roles do you see and have you seen ICT4Peace playing, and what strengths do you think it can bring to these types of discussions?
Well, the whole realm of the internet and cyberspace is one where, of course, the vast majority of users and indeed owners of infrastructure are in the private sector or civil society. So as stakeholders in the future of this unique environment, ICT4Peace, as an exemplary NGO, clearly has a role to play in trying to influence states in their conduct in cyberspace. And this is not, of course, unique to ICT4Peace, but I think we have had limited civil society engagement for a long time on the cyber front, and it's beginning now to change, and I think that's positive. I think we've also seen the private sector, which of course has so much competence and resources to bring to bear, also in the sense of shaking off some of its deferential attitudes towards government to be more of an advocate. Indeed, we've had some enlightened states at certain times recognizing that it wasn't just, it was convenient, to look at the problem. It was only cyber terrorists or cyber criminals, rather than the self-examination about the conduct of the states themselves. But we've had some early calls for, quote, norms for responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And that has been a sort of a rallying point, and one that does give, I think, a standing as well for those stakeholders to continue, in a sense, to press governments to indeed develop, and not just develop those norms, but to implement them in policy and practice.
Well, without getting too much into the weeds, this has been something that is an issue, I would say, in cybersecurity. The difficulty or near impossibility to agree an international legally binding document. At the same time, it does provide perhaps some opportunities for this creative diplomacy that you have been talking about. And I know that also ICT4Peace has been involved in some efforts along those lines. One of them is the call to governments to publicly commit to refrain from cyber operations against civilian critical infrastructure. Have you been involved with this? Can you speak a little bit to this call?
Yes, indeed. I sort of penned most of it, and it reflected the fact that, importantly, among the 11 norms that the 2015 group of governmental experts on cybersecurity had agreed on was the non-targeting of critical infrastructure by cyber means on which the public depended. And immediately I felt that while all of the 11 norms were worthy, that this one was of preeminent importance because clearly there would be devastating consequences if critical infrastructure was undermined, compromised, manipulated, etc. So this was in a sense, a crucial, albeit not fully formed, consensus norm. And I thought it was imperative to try to reinforce it. And so that's how developed this call on governments, basically to do, well, two things. One is a public confirmation that they would abide by that norm in policy and practice. You have to remember that, of course, the GGEs were not fully representative. There was, I think, 20 members. They had consensus recommendations. There was a follow-up resolution that encouraged states to be guided in their activities. But that's not the same as a universal endorsement by states of these recommended norms. So I thought here's an excellent opportunity, in a sense, to press governments to publicly commit themselves to obeying and adhering to that norm at all times. And this was another sort of aspect to the call, because there had been, I think, some weasel wording going on that with certain groups of states that, yes, this would be a norm for peacetime. And this, in my mind, left too many loopholes. I mean, the whole sort of debate around when the threshold of armed conflict is actually reached, under which international humanitarian law kicks in, is a gray zone there. And I felt it was important with such a central core commitment to ensure that it was a blanket prohibition. We don't talk about don't use chemical weapons in peacetime. There's a blanket prohibition on chemical weapons, and I'd like to see in the development of normative behavior a similar comprehensive prohibition on targeting critical infrastructure.
And I really want to get a little bit more into the UN group of governmental experts, but before we go there, I also want to talk a little bit about this call to governments to use multilateral peer review mechanisms to enable peaceful settlements around cyber disputes. I think this is a really interesting, again, idea, another example of this kind of creative diplomacy. And I'd just like to ask you where the genesis for that idea came from, how you kind of see that.
Well, it takes me back basically to Geneva in 2006, when I had the honor of being part of the effort to develop the institution and modalities for the Human Rights Council, which was a creation that had been agreed upon at the 2005 UN summit. And one of the elements of that, which Canada had been a champion of, along with other like-minded states, was the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism, which was a peer review mechanism that recognized that states are most comfortable when they're being reviewed by their peers, i.e. Other states, and that it allowed for universal accountability, because whether or not you were a party to the major international human rights conventions, all UN member states were obligated to to subject themselves to the UPR. So it also was a mechanism that allowed for input from non-governmental sources in the sort of compilation of dossiers that would be made available through the process of the UPR. And there were elements that were behind closed doors, but there were also the conclusions were in a publicly accessible context of a session of the council. So I was inspired in thinking about how can we incentivize states. You can't force states to do things, but you can incentivize them to undertake a process of reviewing mutually and comprehensively their record of implementing the norms that they have signed up to. And so I saw a real need for that in this relatively new area of norms of responsible state behavior, but that it would be a crucial complement and a way of ensuring that the global society at large was not just left with a lot of states paying lip service to certain norms, and yet really no capacity to hold those states to account for their actual practices and conduct in cyberspace. So I think it is, in all modesty, an example of some creative diplomacy, drawing from very, prior sources. And frankly, in multilateral diplomacy, it's often a good idea if you can base your new proposal on existing structures from elsewhere in the broad UN system. And so I see it as the kind of tool that I hope will eventually be recognized by all stakeholders, but particularly the states themselves, as a useful complement to any effort to flesh out the normative framework to govern state behavior.
Well, I think one of the things that's happening right now is with the current pandemic, this is actually throwing into sharp relief a lot of the deficits online as well as in a lot of other areas. But I'm just wondering, what impact do you think this current pandemic will have on these issues?
Well, I mean, the pandemic reminds us of the fact that we live in a globalized world, and the interdependencies are extensive. You know, what happens in one part of the globe invariably is going to affect us in another. I think it also has, and of course, the internet is the quintessential universal technology as well. So it has that sort of, it's also a reminder that we live in a globalized world. Mm-hmm. But in my sort of optimistic phase, you know, I see this as also providing an impetus for international cooperation. I mean, it's been pretty striking how particularly the medical science community and connected private sector entities are collaborating at the new levels of intensity over development of treatments and vaccines for the COVID-19. And they say in an optimistic stream, I'd like to think that maybe this experience will impart an impetus for similar international cooperation in the effort to preserve this unique environment of cyberspace for peaceful purposes, rather than seeing it sort of descend into just another domain of warfighting, as some wish to characterize it.
Well, thank you for that. I have one last question I'd like to pose to you, and this is a future-looking question. What do you see are the broader issues on the ICT horizon? You've touched on some of them, but if you could just maybe do this as a last few words.
Yes, I think I would reiterate what I said about what I see as a very unfortunate upsurge in the militarization of cyberspace. If we can do something to curb or slow down that trend, if not immediately reverse it, I think that's a challenge before us. As we discussed a little earlier, the whole threat of misinformation and disinformation as a disruptive force in particularly democratic societies is something that continue to have to address, and perhaps we'll have some creative solutions come up over time there. We have to remember that there's a human security dimension to all of this, and human security can be imperiled through irresponsible state action, under the banner of national security, but it also can be threatened by efforts at disrupting the social fabric and promoting violence and ethnic hatred and other afflictions. So both of those elements, that there's a cyber dimension to them that we need, I think, to continue to keep in the forefront. And just one other that we haven't mentioned that I think it would be helpful, and again, maybe a natural area for collaboration between civil society and the private sector, is artificial intelligence, which I think is a classic dual-use technology that can both be applied to, in a sense, exacerbate some of the threats from offensive cyber operations, but they can also be used to ameliorate our defenses and our resiliency against malicious cyber activity. So that's a sort of future theme that we will have to develop and try to apply to the better angels of our nature aspect of our cyber activity.
Well, I think it's safe to say, and certainly what we've discussed today, that ICT new technologies are going to continue to influence our societies, both at local, national, and international levels. And so, to the extent that we can actually discuss and find some creative diplomacy and responses to some of these challenges, it's something absolutely we need to continue working on. So I thank you so much for your work on this. And again, thank you so much for being with me and us today.
It was my pleasure, Anne-Marie, and look forward to collaborating with you in ICT4Peace's further efforts.
Excellent. Thank you. And so that concludes this interview. Many thanks to Ambassador Paul Meyer. You'll find below in the notes references to documents and reports that were discussed during the interview. And as mentioned at the beginning, this is the first in the series, so stay tuned for more interesting interviews with the people of ICT4Peace and the work that they are working on. So until next time, take care and stay safe.